Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning again, Mr. Secretary. I must say you have probably the most difficult task this month of being the Secretary of the most emotional issue that we will talk about, and you're still smiling, and I must commend you for your passion and your vigor and your patience. You had mentioned about the need for flexibility in local school district spending, but then you were also cautious about how much flexibility to put protections in place. When you look at Pennsylvania having over 7,000 full-time administrators, and when you look at when we hear things like, teacher layoffs and class sizes increasing, but we still are sitting, we have 7,000 full-time administrators. What is your approach now as this acting secretary and hopefully soon to be secretary of reducing administration costs, being more efficient so we can drive more dollars into the classroom?
So it's a great question, and it's a question that you tackle, educators tackle all throughout our careers. I mean, it's funny that it's a question that we all ask ourselves, from teacher all the way now, through Secretary of Ed. And it's, when you're a teacher and you see what your assistant principal does, you always say, if I ever become an assistant principal, I'm going to do it differently. And then if I ever become a principal, I'm going to do it differently, superintendent and so on. And part of what we have to take a look at it, which is why when we share creating flexibility around the menu, as opposed to, just open-ended flexibility, that's where that's important. So when you think of, so why so many administrators? One of the first things I did in my previous district and actually engaged in before in Philadelphia was looked at a reduction in central office and administrative positions, and we were able to reduce a good number of positions to make sure that they were at least building-based and classroom-based supports. But there's a practical issue that we deal with in terms of the number of administrators we have. You take just into account when we look at educator effectiveness, and we say every new teacher has to be observed 4 times a year. And then you look at a comprehensive high school, and let's say you have 200 teachers in a comprehensive high school. Let's say 50 of them are new teachers, and so that constitutes 200 classroom observations. And you start to think back, when I went to high school, I only had 1 assistant principal and 1 principal. So why this increase? Well, just to fulfill, state and federal, and sometimes local mandates, you need the additional manpower just to go into classrooms and engage in those observations. And observations aren't important if you don't provide good quality feedback. So it's the time that it takes, believe it or not, to really observe and provide feedback to do it in a meaningful way for a teacher is a 4-hour minimal process. So this is what starts to happen as you start to engage in new special education law, as you start to engage in requirements for English language learners around educator effectiveness, when you start to engage in federal programs guidelines and PIAA guidelines. Who monitors that? I mean, for example, when you start to take a look at background, the last issue I fought with HR around the new background check law was they needed 2 new, human resources analysts just to go through all the criminal background checks, and I pushed back and said, we have to find a different way to do this. But as when you hear superintendents saying unfunded mandates, that's what they're pushing back on. So part of what we have to do together is take a look at what our expectations are of school districts and really take into account what resources are needed locally to fulfill those expectations.
And I think you gave an olive branch, and I will take that in ways that we can work together now to reduce administrative costs. However we can do that, I think it's a valuable initiative. I don't want to hold you specifically to the budget office outline, but I'm sure you are familiar with what is in their outline. The need for reserve balance reform. I think in spite of the claims that Pennsylvania has been underinvesting in our education, if we look at school district reserve balances, they're sitting on $4 billion of reserve funds. And actually, while the claims were that we cut $1 billion over the last 4 years, over $1 billion have been added to the reserve balances. So a two-part question. Why the Budget Office is specifically singling out cyber school funding as it relates to their reserve balance, while they only represent, I think, about 1.5% of the students. Why the elimination of the cyber school reserve balance when the legislature has been working to reform their reserve balance and create fairness in the reserve balance? The governor's plan as it relates to cyber school funding reform seems to be ignorant of the legislature's initiatives to reform that system that we could agree desperately needs reformed.
Mm-hmm. So first, I think that's where the work of the School Funding Commission is going to be extremely helpful by establishing predictability of the school school funding. One of the reasons that school districts and all school districts, charter, cyber and traditional school districts tend to create a fund balance is they're unsure as to what the future look like in relation to spending, so they save money. But I will share. I want to make sure I answer specifically why cyber schools. Quite honestly, we saw it as a good start, and we viewed it as as an easier connection to make. So by identifying the 5 most successful cyber programs out there and adjusting, I guess, averaging up the cost educator.
I was going to get to the education, the piece of it, the funding, but specifically why single out the reserve balances of when school districts are sitting on $4 billion of reserves and $145 million of that is cyber? Why the elimination of the reserve balances just for cyber and not address the other $3.9 billion still sitting in reserve balances?
Changes in school code language we are looking at, or law. I want to make sure I'm not using them interchangeably if I'm wrong, but we are looking at specifically language that will monitor the fund balance for traditional public school systems as well.
Well, I sure hope so, just because the report here singles out cyber specifically, and I'm sure the chairman's going to interrupt me any minute now, and so I will wait to talk about this significant cut to cyber school funding in round 2. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.